So our topic is life as story, and today I'll begin by mentioning that my book that recently came out in English as Become Blessed, Jewish Spirituality Between East and West, only after the book came out in the Hebrew, only afterwards I realized that what is the story behind the book. So I'd like to begin by sharing with you the central argument of thesis of that book, Become Blessed, and then share with you what I discovered about the story behind the book. I argue in that book that the East-West divide is often seen as a divide between what's referred to as doing and as being. When we say the West is about doing is about changing the world. Doing is active. Doing focuses on the future. On the other hand, being focuses on changing the world, but learning how to accept the world as it is. The focus is not on the past or the present, but being present in the here and now. A famous anecdote in a book called India by Azriel Kalbach, that Kalbach is talking together with the Prime Minister of India, and Kalbach's listening to all the problems India has. And he says, so the question is, what to do? And then the Prime Minister says, I see you must be European. Here, we don't ask what to do, we ask what to be. It's almost like a paraphrase on the famous line in Hamlet. To be or not to be becomes to be or to do. Okay, so we have this, but these two impulses, these two great questions, when I face life, what is the big question? Is it about what to do or what to be? And in Become Blessed, I argue that Judaism incorporates both dimensions of the East and that of the West, of the doing and the being. One simple example is the structure of our time. 6 days of the week, it's about the doing. One day, Shabbat, it's an absence of doing, which allows us to focus on the being. But being as it may, often for years, I've told my students that I really only have two basic insights to share with them. And both insights come from very personal and also painful stories. But somehow, only after the book came out, I realized that the doing and the being that I talk so much about, how to integrate them, really are parallel, the two formative insights of my life, that one is an insight that relates to the doing part of life, answering the great question about what to do, and the other insight relates to the being aspect of our lives, about what to be. In our last class, I spoke about one of those insights. I shared with you how the confronting the tragic death of one of my students, Avi Sabag, led me to think differently about life, to see to redeem my view of a short life was to try to focus, to realize that life is about each day that we live, and how each day can be seen as a fulfillment in itself. I mean, that was our last week's topic. A day is an achievement. A day is a world in itself. So therefore, even a short life has had thousands of days of fulfillment. And I spoke about how that evolved into the ceremony we do at the beginning of every class by saying today's unique date, realizing how unique and special today is. Okay, so I realized that's really teaching about being, about living every day as a world in itself, which helps us focus on being present. The pasuk I say, that I try to say every day, that Ze hayom asa Hashem nagila v'nismecha bo. This is the day that God has made. Let us fill it with joy. This is a vantage point on reality of being. It's not trying to change the world. It's trying to open up our eyes and see that life itself is a great blessing. Now, today, I would like to share the second insight that I always tell my students, the insight number 2 to share with you. And again, only after my book came out, I realized that just like the first insight is about the being, the second insight is about the doing. And this goes back to yet another tragic event. And about 18 years ago, there was a terrorist attack in the yeshiva itself of Othniel. It was a Friday night, meaning the night of Shabbos, and in the kitchen, 4 of the waiters were preparing the next course when suddenly terrorists entered the kitchen, and they killed all 4 of our students that were there. And one of the more shocking aspects of that terrible event was that as the shooting began, the students that were in the dining room, were saying the verse, Hodu, we're singing and dancing around the verse, Hodu Lashem ki tov ki liolam chasdo. Praise God, for it is good. And the contrast between the good, a song talking about the good in the world, and seeing the ultimate acts of evil taking place, this was overwhelming, that confrontation with the words from the book of Psalms, from Tehillim, and the realities. And I was deeply moved to see that the families of those 4 boys at the memorials, the families danced together and sing that verse from the book of Tehillim, Hodu Lashem ki tov ki liolam chasdo. And this was really occupying me, how to connect these 2 parts of this story. But one day I saw a very profound teaching of one of the great Hasidic masters, the Rebbe of Ishbitz. The Ishbitzer Rebbe lived about 200 years ago in Poland, and his insight allowed to find some way to connect to that event. There's a passage in the Talmud that says that there was a debate about life between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel said, Noach la'adam shenivra. It's Noach, which is often could be translated as better or more comfortable that we were created. And then Beit Shammai says, no, Noach ladam shelo nivra. It would have been better had we never been born. Now, that's a pretty pessimistic take on life. But so far, I say so far so good, because we know that usually Beit Hillel are considered to be much more happy, joyful, and Beit Shammai very strict. However, it says that after several years of discussion, they came to the conclusion that Beit Shammai is right. Noach ladam shelo nivra. Could have been better had we never been born. Now, obviously, this is a majorly pessimistic statement, would seem to be. In America, they'd probably start class action suits, law cases against parents for bringing them to the world when it says it would have been better had we never been born. But the Ishbitzer Rebbe has a tremendous insight. He says, it doesn't say in the Talmud, Tov ladam shelo nivra. The Talmud doesn't say it would have been good had we never been born. The Talmud says it's Noach ladam shelo nivra. And again, Noach can mean better, but also means easier, more comfortable. And then he interprets the Talmud as saying the follows. It could be the place from which we came from, the place that we return to. Life is easier. Life is often difficult. Life's filled with all sorts of challenges. However, and that's what the Talmud is saying, that Noach ladam shelo nivra, it would have been easier. Easier would have been not to have come to this world with all its challenges and difficulties and complexities. But nevertheless, he affirms, Tov ladam shenivra. It's good that we were born, and it's good that we came to this world. Now, I find that distinction to be very incredibly significant. The making a distinction in life between these two questions, choosing between the good or choosing between that which is easy, that which is comfortable. Because we know that often, even the Torah, and I'm sure all religious traditions talk about choosing between good and evil. However, most people, the people that we know, the people that are here with us tonight, we don't get up in the morning and think about what evil, should I do good today or should I do evil today? The people we are, the people we know are decent people. But nevertheless, we are challenged. And the challenge that we have is not between choosing that which is good and that which is evil. It's about choosing that which is good and that path which is easier. If it's to get out of bed in the morning and do what you have to do. If you don't get out of bed in the morning, you're not a bad person. You haven't done something evil. But you've chosen the easier path rather than the good. If you don't notice the needs of the people around you, you haven't chosen the path of evil, but you've chosen something easier. If you demand more of yourself or less of yourself, it's not about good or evil. It's about choosing the good or choosing that which is easy. So and I feel that every day, every hour, we are making these decisions. We're getting to a crossroads, and there are two signs there. One sign says, to the good, and the other sign says, to the easy path. So, and raising our consciousness to the choices we make and raising our consciousness that part of the meaning of life is choosing the good and not that which is easy. I think this helps us make the right choices. And in fact, we know that in Judaism often talks about the two inclinations people have. In Hebrew, it would be the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, the good inclination and the evil inclination. But I tell my students that the evil inclination, he's history. The real challenge, your real enemy, it's your Yetzer Noach. Wow, and okay, well, I see so many good friends here. Hello, Yaakov. Thanks for joining us. And everybody's warmly welcome to open their videos so I could see everybody's faces. And we can see each other also. Anyway, okay, so in terms of the big question of what to do, the big question of doing is learning to choose between that which is good and that which is easy. And only 2 years after Gershon, you want? Did you raise your hand to say something? Please.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
In the beginning of make a profound statement.
Okay. In the beginning of your course, you're talking about integrated diversity between the two sides. And yes, in Judaism, they call it integrated diversity, like with Rav Kook or Jonathan Sachs or whatever. And that's not familiar in the East. And it's also not familiar in the West, in the Greek thinking, because it's dualistic. And we are thinking in dialogue between the two.
Yes.
But now you are talking in two ways, the easy way and the good way, like if it's either or. But do you think it can be both? Because when you do good, like to be friendly, at the end, when you practice it, it will be easy. So I think in Judaism, it's always integration of the two different poles. Do you think, or do you understand what I'm trying to say?
First of all, a big confession to make. So yeah, I have all my confessors here. I do like it when things are easy. So I don't think the good doesn't have to be something which is not easy. We don't have to make things hard for ourselves. But sometimes when we have to make a choice, we should have the inner strength to choose, make the good and not the easy. But you're right, the issue of how to integrate doing and being, this really is the topic of the book I mentioned, Become Blessed. Now mentioning this almost on a side to talk in this course, which talks about the power of stories. So the philosophical integrations, I'm going to leave that out for now. But going back to this story, 2 years after the terrorist attack, I was in Shiloh at a memorial for one of the 4 boys, was called Noam Apter. And suddenly I realized how profoundly this insight is the story of that terrorist attack. Because in a story that was very famous then in Israel, when the shooting began in the kitchen where the 4 waiters were, the doors that separated the kitchen from the dining room were closed and locked. And the terrorists tried to break through. They didn't manage to break through. And what we think happened, we can't know, is that the boys in the kitchen realized that what they must do is stop the terrorists from getting into the dining room where there are dozens and dozens of students. And if that's the case, then that reflects this question of choosing 2 paths and certainly this would be choosing the more difficult path of self-sacrifice. Now, relating to that event, there are other aspects that we do know about. For example, in the dining room, outside, one of the students called Asaf, when the shooting began, like everybody, he ran away, right? When people start shooting, you run in the other direction. This is a very famous, very logical principle. But after running, he thought to himself, after a few seconds, look, I'm an older student. If I don't take responsibility and charge of what's happening, who will? So he chose to go back and to confront the terrorists. He led the soldiers in a counterattack. And since he was leading, he was critically injured. He said Shema Yisrael, he closed his eyes, and to his great surprise and our great joy, after a long time, he opened his eyes again. And in fact, this Sunday, they're having a Brit Milah for their new son. So certainly there, the parts that we do know, it's about the good and a choice being made. The easier choice is run away, hide, protect yourself. And nobody would come with any complaints if somebody did that. But he chose to do the difficult choice and not that which is easier. Now, to give a slightly lighter tone to some of these, to this insight, I'm a big fan of the 7-volume. I and most of humanity are fans of the 7-volume Harry Potter series. And in fact, certainly overall, a theme throughout the books is choosing the path which is good as opposed to the path which is easy. But there's one place, and I won't give too many details, not to spoil anything for those who still have all this wonderful reading in front of them, is that in the 4th volume, there's also something that could be viewed at as a terrorist attack. And Dumbledore gathers the students together and he says to them, there are difficult times in front of us and you will have to choose. And surprisingly, he doesn't say you're going to have to choose between the good or the evil. He says, no, you'll have to choose between the path which is good and the path that is easy. Because Dumbledore knows that the problem is not those few people that choose to do evil. The problem is the so many people that look away and say, it's not our problem, it's somebody else's problem, and they don't get involved. So this is the challenge of even as societies. I think it's never, I think, that the majority of society is out there doing evil. But many societies will have many people choosing to look away, not get involved, and allow those people who want to hurt to do what they're doing. I grew up on the in the 1970s on the struggle for the freedom of Soviet Jewry, and in the movement for Soviet Jewry, there was one very dramatic event. Was in 1971. Yosef Mendelevitz, with some other friends, tried to hijack a plane to bring them to Israel. And apparently they knew that the KGB was on their tail, but they decided not to abort the plan, but to go through with it, to show a cry from beyond the curtain of the Soviet Union to the West, that their brothers could hear their cry. So they did what they did. Some of them were originally sentenced to death, although it was commuted. And one of the turning points in the Soviet Jewry movement was when a group of young students, including my parents, decided to rent the largest auditorium in America then, I think, Madison Square Garden, that has tens of thousands of seats. And the slogan they had that was a turning point in the Soviet Jewry movement, a movement of individuals to individuals, a movement of tens and hundreds of thousands, was that event. Now the sign, the poster calling people to come to that event, which I grew up having this poster on the wall of our house, was "Silence kills. Won't you speak out for Soviet Jewry?" So the call is, the danger is the silence. Silence kills. And tens of thousands of people saw that sign, and they came. And after that, this became the issue of freedom for Soviet Jewry became a major issue in American Jewry. And ultimately, pressures were made that led to the freedom of the Jews behind the Iron Curtain. Okay, so maybe I'll take this point a bit further about the good and the easy. There, about a month after that terrorist attack, the commander-in-chief of the Israeli army came to speak at our yeshiva in Otniel. This is Rabbi Ya'akon, and although he is secular, he gave a very inspiring speech. First point he said was, as the head of the Israeli army, one of the challenges he has is knowing when push comes to shove, when what gives soldiers the strength to risk their lives, go out and fight, and fight. And he says every army has a different answer to this question. But he says, I draw my inspiration from Pirkei Avot, that says, I'll say first in Hebrew, Ezehu Gibor HaKovesh et Yitzro. Who is the hero? The person who overcomes the inclinations inside of him. And clearly, he's understanding the Yetzer, not as the Yetzer to do evil, but as I said, the Yetzer for the easy path. And then he said, but how? How does someone have the strength to overcome natural inclinations, such as stay safe, stay out of trouble? And he said he feels it's connected to the extent that someone is connected to his people, to his nation, to their heritage. And that's why, although he's secular, he strongly believes about the value of Jewish education, because it's that identity that gives the people that inner willpower to do what they have to do in the army. And this reminds me of a lovely story about the first encounter between Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz, who was ultimately the chief rabbi of England, and Margaret Thatcher, who was the prime minister eventually of England. When they first met, Thatcher was the minister of education, but Jacobowitz turns to her and says, hello, madam, the minister of defense. And there was a uncomfortable silence. And she says, oh, excuse me, Rabbi, you're mistaken. I'm the minister of education. And he says, no, I'm not mistaken. The true minister of defense is the Minister of Education. The level of defense that a country has is dependent on the level, quality of the education. Okay, let me, maybe this section, let me end with one more story. And this story of about somebody that I see that David is with us. David, you were in yeshiva when Nati Erez was. Am I?
Yeah, of course.
Of course, yeah.
My Chavruta Nati Erez.
Okay, so this is about one of our very holy students, Nati Erez. And if anyone needs any proof about how special he was David's Chavruta. Now, Nati once came to me, and I feel I'm able to tell the story because I know he tells it himself, and spoke about some of the difficulties in his life. And he asked me if I could give him some advice about how to have some more joy in his life. But I heard about the challenges he had and the pain he had. So I said, I think it would be insensitive for me to go and give you a couple of tips, a couple of advice about joy. I said, but Nati, let me tell you something else. Now, Nati, he was always helping people. He would run the prayers in the yeshiva. He would help out in the kitchen. He would teach the little children in the yeshuv, in the settlement, would come to him. When the Rosh Yeshiva needed somebody to drive them somewhere, he'd be the driver. I said, Nati, I don't know about joy, but you're always choosing to do the good. And in terms of your life, know how meaningful your life is. And I shared to him about life, about being choosing between the good and the easy. And another teaching I shared with him is connected to a famous story that Rav Shlomo Carlebach used to say about the Rebbe of Piazetzna, that that would always repeat the phrase that 1 second. People are very joyful here. I'll ask them to be a little bit quiet, Jeffer. Okay, sorry about that. That the greatest thing in the world is to do somebody a favor. This is the motto of the Rebbe of Piazetzner. And there's some famous story that Rav Shlomo Carlebach tells about a person who, in the hardest times, that teaching, that the greatest thing in the world is to do somebody a favor, is what gave them the strength to choose what they chose. Now, the Second Lebanon War broke out. And as many of our students, Nati also went to fight in Lebanon. And at the end of the war, I heard that Nati ended up in a hospital. And I thought, how sometimes life isn't fair. Is that Nati who has dealing with so many issues, and he's the one that ends up in the hospital. But after the war, he came back and he told his story. Nati there was an ambush that the Hezbollah did, and many Israeli soldiers were killed, and there were tanks going up in flames. And Nati said it was the hardest thing he ever did, but he went into these burning tanks. Some people he took out were injured, and one ultimately recovered, even though he began, I think, in a coma. And some, as he said very delicately, were no longer injured. And afterwards, he said it was so traumatic seeing what he had to see that he couldn't eat or drink, so he was dehydrated, and that's why he ended up in the hospital. But after the war, he said what gave him the strength to do what he had to do was that saying of the Rebbe of Piazetzna, that the greatest thing in the world, the biggest thing in the world is doing a tova, doing good to somebody else. Okay, so here's the power of some of the story that ultimately led to this insight that I hope and try to guide me. Now, going back to the beginning of what we spoke about today. So as I said, there are two fundamental insights. There's the insight about the being and the insight about the doing. And my book, it is about Jewish spirituality between East and West. But not only are these two basic insights paralleling these two basic impulses of doing and being, but the truth is they really led to each other. And I'll explain. Noam Apter was in my class at the time. When at the yeshiva, he began what he called the Merkaz Lemudu'ut Yehudit, the Center for Jewish Consciousness. He said, we can't wait for the Jewish people to come to the Beit Midrash. We have to bring the Beit Midrash to the Jewish people. And that's why our David went out to Argentina. And he would keep pushing me out of the Beit Midrash. He would say, Rav Yaakov, go give a class to students in Beersheba. Rav Yaakov, go to the central bus station in Beersheba to hand out Shabbos candles and help people put on tefillin. And one of my greatest strengths is it's hard for me to say no. So I found myself doing all these things that weren't exactly my comfort zone. But after Noam was killed, I said, now I'll have to push myself out of the Beit Midrash. So I decided that I'll try to find opportunities, and somehow, no matter how crazy, if I'm asked to do something, to try to do it. And one year I was invited to what was then called the Bumba Mela. The Bumba Mela was a Israeli festival patterned after the Kumbh Mela, which is the largest Hindu holiday in the world. And this was a festival on the beach, a lot of drugs. Part of it was a nudist beach, a lot of rock music, different Hindu temples. And I was there to try to help give a Jewish perspective for a lot of these people there were so much searching. And at the Bumba Mela, I pretty much, which I went to in wake of Noam, ultimately the conception about Judaism incorporating doing and being really emerged when I was on the sands of the beach at the Bumba Mela, because I thought to give a lecture about the similarities between the syllable that in the East represents the unity of existence, the Om, and that Hebrew word Shalom. But then I thought to myself that Om and Shalom, they're really not the same. Shalom includes the Om, but Shalom obviously is more than the Om. And that led me, and then ultimately I saw a teaching in the Zohar that what is Shalom? Shalom is the integration between the Shin that represents Eish, fire, and the Mem that represents the Mayim, the water. Shalom integrates fire and water. It integrates opposites. And this led me to the conception of Judaism as including the doing and the being. This led to a trip to India and my writings about Jewish spirituality. So not only is there a parallelism between these two fundamental concepts, doing and being, and these two insights that came out of these painful personal stories, but there's an unfolding of events that one led to the other. And maybe I'll end for today with a closure of this story. When my book first came out on Jewish spirituality in 2013, I was invited to be a guest lecturer for a Shabbat in the Jewish town of Alon. And on Friday night, I'm doing a Onig Shabbat with people from the community. And I'm telling some stories from the Bumamela. And I see somebody there with a long beard and long peot. And I see that he seems to be deeply touched and very emotional. And afterwards, he comes over to me and says, I used to be the producer of the Bumamela. So at least some of those who are so deeply searching at the Bumamela, some of them found themselves back home. And here again, I see, as I think I'm thinking philosophical ideas, but then I realize it's all about the story. Okay, so Bezrat Hashem, next week, I'll be happy at the same time for to continue again with Life is the Story. I see someone is asking about the book. I don't know what country the person was Eliana is in, but it's on from Israel. Okay, so it's from Israel. It's on the internet, either through the Yeshiva Otniel. It's put out by Magid. In America, it's sold through Amazon, and Europe there's Book Depository. All the best to all of you, and we'll end with the pasuk from the book of Kohelet. Sof davar, hakol nishma, et Elohim yirah, ve'et mitzvotav shmor, ki ze kol ha'adam.